The midsummer sun of 1518 did not bring warmth to the narrow, timber-framed streets of Strasbourg. It brought a fever that defied the soul. The air in the Rhine Valley was thick that July, heavy with the scent of river silt, open sewers, and the unwashed wool of thousands huddled within the city walls. It began with a single footfall. It wasn't the step of a traveller or a merchant, but of a woman named Frau Troffea. She stepped into a small cobblestone square and began to dance. There was no music. There was no celebration. There was only the rhythmic, agonizing scrape of leather against stone. She did not smile. Her face was a mask of grim, solitary determination. Her body jerked as if pulled by invisible wires. People stopped to watch, expecting a performance or perhaps a momentary fit of religious ecstasy. But the moment stretched into minutes, then hours. For 6 days she danced. She danced through the sweltering heat of the day and the chilling damp of the Alsatian night. Her feet bled, soaking her stockings in a deep, iron-rich crimson, yet she did not stop. When she finally collapsed, it wasn't out of peace, but out of sheer psychological failure, only to twitch and restart the moment her breath returned. Within a week, 34 others had joined her. By the end of the month, the number had swelled to 400. This was not a festival. It was a nightmare of motion. Imagine your heart being forced to run a marathon every single day for a month straight. That was the physical reality in Strasbourg. These people weren't dancing the way we do at a party. They weren't celebrating. They were convulsing. Their muscles would have reached a literal breaking point, a state where the fibers actually disintegrate and leak into the bloodstream. A process we now call rhabdomyosis. Every breath would have felt like swallowing fire. The sheer biological defiance of it is what haunts historians. How does a human body, deprived of sleep and sustained nourishment, continue to exert such violent energy? They were trapped in a cycle of movement that their bodies couldn't sustain, but their minds couldn't stop. The accounts from that summer describe a scene of pure, distilled madness. People were screaming, not in joy, but in a desperate plea for it to end. They begged for help, even as their legs continued to kick and spin. They were prisoners of their own nervous system. To understand why this happened, we have to look at the world these people inhabited. 1518 wasn't just another year in the Holy Roman Empire, it was a year of peak anxiety. The region was a tinderbox of suffering. For years, harvests had failed. Bread prices had soared to levels that meant a choice between starvation or crushing debt. The social fabric of Strasbourg was fraying. The city was overcrowded, and the divide between the wealthy clergy and the starving peasantry was a gaping wound. Diseases like the sweating sickness and the great pox, what we now know as syphilis, were tearing through the population. In a world where science as we know it didn't exist, every misfortune was interpreted as a direct message from the divine. If the crops failed, God was angry. If a child fell ill, a demon was at work. The people of Strasbourg lived in a state of constant, low-level spiritual terror. They believed the veil between our world and the supernatural was paper-thin. When Frau Troffea began to dance, her neighbours didn't see a medical emergency, they saw a spiritual infection. The civic and religious leaders in Strasbourg were baffled. They called upon the finest minds of the time, the physicians. These men didn't look at germs or psychology, they practiced medicine based on the balance of 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. After observing the dancers, these doctors reached a conclusion that seems insane to us today, but was perfectly logical to them. The victims were suffering from hot blood. They believed the body was trying to burn off an excess of heat through movement. In one of the most disastrously logical decisions in history, the city council decided that the only cure for dancing was more dancing. They didn't isolate the afflicted or tie them down. Instead, they opened the grain markets to create more space, constructed massive wooden stages, and incredibly, hired professional musicians. The council paid for pipers and drummers. They even hired strongmen, healthy individuals whose only job was to hold the dancers upright when they began to faint, forcing them to keep moving. They believed that if the victims could just dance the fever out of their bodies, the plague would break. Instead, they provided a soundtrack to a massacre. The lively pipes and drums acted as a metronome for death. The more the music played, the more the rhythm took hold of the crowd, drawing in the curious and terrified alike. People began to die, not by a handful, but by the dozens. At the height of the plague, it is said that 15 people were dying every single day. Strokes, heart attacks, and pure exhaustion claimed them on the very stages built for their recovery. How does a city simply lose its mind? For centuries, historians and scientists have picked at the scab of the 1518 plague, looking for a rational explanation for the irrational. One of the most popular theories involves Claviceps purpurea, a fungus that grows on damp rye known as ergot. When consumed, ergot produces alkaloids chemically related to LSD. It can cause vivid hallucinations, tremors, and violent muscle spasms. This theory is popular because it offers a clear chemical culprit. It suggests the entire town was essentially tripping on poisonous bread. However, ergotism has a dark side that makes the dancing plague unlikely. It restricts blood flow to the extremities, often leading to gangrene. It is physically impossible for someone with severe ergotism to sustain the grueling athletic endurance required to dance for days. Their limbs would have failed them long before they could reach the town square. The most compelling modern theory is one of mass psychogenic illness, a mass psychosis. In 1518, the people of Strasbourg held a specific, terrifying belief in Saint Vitus. He was a 4th century Christian martyr who, according to legend, could cast a dancing curse on those who angered him. Under extreme psychological pressure, the human mind can fracture. If a community collectively believes in a specific supernatural threat, the brain can manifest physical symptoms that align with that belief. This is the same mechanism behind the Salem witch trials or the laughter epidemic of Tanzania. Frau Troffea wasn't just a person who started dancing, she was the spark in a room full of psychological gasoline. The dancing was a physical manifestation of a collective nervous breakdown. People joined in not because they wanted to, but because their brains, primed by fear and exhaustion, simply surrendered to the social contagion. They saw others dancing, and their own mirror neurons, the part of the brain that makes us yawn when we see someone else yawn, took over. As the bodies piled up, the city's mood shifted from scientific experimentation to religious panic. The doctors had failed. The musicians had only made things worse. The city council eventually banned all public music and dancing, even at weddings. They declared the plague was a punishment from God for the city's sins, specifically the sins of gambling and profanity. The dancers were no longer seen as sick patients, but as cursed sinners. They were rounded up, sometimes forcibly, and loaded into heavy wooden wagons. The air was filled with the sound of weeping and the constant, rhythmic thudding of feet against the floorboards of the carts. They were being taken to the shrine of Saint Vitus in the hills of Saverne. At the shrine, the ritual was as strange as the plague itself. The survivors were led into the cool, dark grotto of the saint. Their bloody swollen feet were placed into small shoes that had been painted bright red. They were given small crosses and led in circles around an altar while priests sprayed them with holy water and chanted incantations. Whether it was the change in environment or the cessation of music or the sheer power of religious suggestion, the compulsions stopped. By September, the fever had broken. The stages in the city square were torn down. The musicians were sent home. The cobblestones were washed of the blood and sweat of 400 souls. But the mystery remains carved into the annals of the city. It serves as a haunting reminder of the fragility of the human mind and the terrifying power of the collective. We like to think of ourselves as individuals, masters of our own limbs and logic. But in the summer of 1518, the people of Strasbourg proved that sometimes we are nothing more than leaves caught in a wind we cannot see and music we cannot hear. The dancing plague is often dismissed as a weird footnote in history, but it forces us to look at the dark side of human empathy, the way we can catch a feeling or a movement until it destroys us. It shows us that under enough pressure, the human mind will create its own reality, even if that reality kills the body.